Good evening. Good evening and welcome. I am Melanie Ramey, the chair of the Madison Committee on Foreign Relations, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you to this, our second event of the season. Before we begin about this evening's event, I want to mention the next one, which will be on November the 1st, which is Tuesday. This will be a dinner meeting with Dr. Damian Felton. Dr. Felton is with the Cohen Group, and they advise businesses on how to do business in China. He has just completed 17 years in the United States Department of Commerce. A number of those years, he was at the American Embassy in Beijing. So he's a very big expert on the whole thing of China, and he will be talking with us about the geopolitical dynamics of what's happening now in China and how to navigate some of the trade issues and security issues that are going on. Now, the important thing to know is that this is November the 1st, which is Tuesday. However, it's important that you go on our website and make your reservation for the dinner. The website is mcfr.info, I-N-F-O. So immediately go on there after we get finished this evening, if you will, or at least by October the 25th to make the reservation. Those of you who have been attending the dinners know that these are really quite interesting. We have very good dinner. We have a glass of wine, some coffee. We have lots of good table mates. And we also have outstanding presentations and an opportunity to ask and have discussion. So I would certainly hope that you're planning to attend, and that will be on November 1st, but please do get reserved by October the 25th. So now let's move on to our presentation of the evening on global food and security. We are so fortunate to have with us Dr. Christopher Barrett of Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. But Dr. Barrett has spent some time in Madison at the university here, and he declares himself to be a Badger. So we'll just take his word for that. Dr. Barrett has the chair of the chair at Ithaca in applied economics and management. He is also an international professor in the Dyson Institute there. He is also a professor of international development in the Brooks School of Public Policy there. And I have a vision of Dr. Barrett as being a marathon runner, dashing all about the campus at Cornell, trying to keep up with himself. Because in addition to all of this, he is a writer and an editor of some outstanding journals in this area of food and security. So tonight he will be talking with us on the linkage between food and security in countries. And so it's with a great deal of pleasure that I welcome Dr. Christopher Barrett. Dr. Barrett.
Thank you very much, Melanie, for the kind welcome, and thank you all for inviting me to be here. And I think I can clearly establish I am indeed a Badger, because I see Dan Bromley on this call, and Dan was the faculty member who recruited me to Wisconsin's PhD program back in 1990. So I'm a 1994 alumnus from UW Madison, and very proud of it. As I mentioned to Melanie earlier, I brought two souvenirs back with me from Wisconsin. They're my oldest two daughters, who were both born there while we were graduate students. So we all have very fond memories of Madison.
Dr. Barrett, excuse me just a minute. I forgot to mention that the chat room will be opened on the right of the screen, and people should put their questions in the chat room because I know there'll be a lot of questions, and I will ask the questions at the end of your presentation. And so I'm sorry I forgot to mention that, so please continue.
No worries, thank you. So I'm pleased to get a chance to chat with you all about global food security is going to be the primary emphasis here, but I'm going to try to tease out its implications for global security. As Melanie mentioned, I am trained as an agricultural economist at UW, and I edit the journal Food Policy. I do a lot of work on global food security issues. I also had an earlier career as a military officer, and I've maintained some connections with the national intelligence community and the national security community out of Washington, D.C. And as I'll talk about, actually did some work for them around the food crisis that the world faced about a dozen years ago. So the key things that I want to talk about are, first, do we have a food security crisis? The popular press clearly believes we do. It's been predicting this for some time. I've just taken a few headlines from prominent places here. Time from 2018, even pre-pandemic, the world is headed for a food security crisis. The New York Times, early in the pandemic, the global food crisis looms. And perhaps most evocatively, the Economist earlier this year with this cover that if you look closely, the sheaths of wheat are in fact human skulls. So this is rather stark imagery and striking claims and headlines that catch the popular attention. But is there really a food security crisis currently? And I'm going to submit to you that yes, there is a food security crisis as manifest in these numbers. This graphic plots kind of the two main indicators used most widely globally. In blue, red against the left-hand vertical axis, is the percentage of the population that declares themselves moderately or severely food insecure. As you can see, since that measure first began in 2014, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, FAO, has been gathering these data in collaboration with Gallup World Surveys since 2014. We've seen this share of the population that is food insecure creeping upwards, taking a rather stark jump upwards in 2020 due to COVID. But on the right-hand side, we see a head count, the number of people who are undernourished. These are not the same measures. So you'll notice that 770 million people is not 29% of the global population. The percent that's undernourished, or the number of people undernourished, is the head count of those who are expected any given night to go to bed without sufficient caloric intake. So it's a dietary energy-based measure. So all the indicators tell us that the number of people who are perceiving themselves to be food insecure or seem to not be taking in enough calories to maintain body mass and a healthy life do seem to be increasing and have been steadily since roughly 2014. But I submit this is only one way of looking at the data, and an equally important way of looking at the data will help you to recognize that it's not so much we have a crisis as progress has stalled. So in this graphic, I take the same undernourishment data, but now I add to that the number of people who are not undernourished, the number of people in the world who get adequate caloric intake. And that's a very low bar to clear, by the way. That does not mean people are not malnourished. This will include people who suffer obesity or suffer mineral and vitamin deficiencies. But this was really the target 50 years ago, 60 years ago, when the world was concerned about, some of you remember Population Bomb, Paul Ehrlich's very famous book claiming that we were heading to a Malthusian crisis. We were going to have famines because populations were rising too fast and the world couldn't produce food fast enough to feed everybody. Well, then something called the Green Revolution was happening during that time. And lo and behold, the world managed to produce enough to feed this growing population, and it has continued to do so. So while it is absolutely true that we have, if I could take all these data back further, I could take the number undernourished data earlier in time, and you would have seen a declining curve up until that 2014 point. The numbers who are undernourished had been falling. While it is true that we've been seeing a growth in the number of people and the share of people whose food security is in question, we have seen an even faster growth in the number of people who get plenty of nutrient intake, at least macronutrient intake, to lead a healthy life. On average, since 2000, we've been increasing the number of people who are not undernourished by more than 82 million a year, while the number who've been undernourished have decreased rather slowly, but have decreased. So about 2 million a year. So what you really see happening now is we had been making steady progress until about 2014, and that progress has stalled out. And the crisis is less that the world is about to fall off a cliff, that we're about to see human skulls as sheaves of wheat in some great famine that takes over the world. Rather, the problem is that we have stalled out on progress that was very real for most of our lifetimes, and there are serious headwinds we face ahead. So the challenges are formidable. And there is no guarantee that we're going to meet these challenges, although if I had to bet, I think we will. So the formidable challenges really arise. I'm an economist, so I have to use demand and supply. They arise from both the demand side and the supply side. On the demand side, there's really three big drivers, and these are inexorable. There is nothing we are going to do to change these. The first is population growth, and that's the single biggest driver of food demand growth. The per capita consumption of food in the world has not been changing appreciably for 20 years in terms of basic commodity production. If you look, for example, at how much grain is produced and goes into the food channel per person per year, that is essentially a flat line for 20, 25 years. The growth has been in feed for livestock and in fuels, biofuels. The population growth is heavily concentrated, will be heavily concentrated in Asia and especially in Africa. The graphic on the left just shows you the most recent credible forecasts of where is population growth through the end of the century. And one of the things that should jump right out to you is that the high income world of Europe and North America, populations have largely peaked. Populations are indeed declining in much of the high income world. And even in East Asia, we're pretty close to peak now. The major area of population growth is sub-Saharan Africa. Populations will continue to grow there at least through the end of the century. That's the big driver. But the second big driver is income growth. Poorer countries on average do grow faster, and poorer countries, for every extra dollar of income, spend more of that dollar on additional food demand. This is something called Engel's law in economics. So economic growth concentrated in poor countries where population growth is also higher drives much of the future demand for food. My back of the envelope estimates are somewhere between 50 and 75% of the added food demand in the world between now and 2100 will occur in sub-Saharan Africa. That is going to be the locus of most food demand growth over the remainder of this century. Urbanization contributes to this as well, just by elongating supply chains, more people removed at greater distances from where most food is produced. Together, these three things, population growth, income growth, urbanization, which are largely irresistible forces in the global economy, these lead to very robust demand growth. Facing that, we have slowing supply growth, and this really arises from three different things. The first is that we have very serious land and water constraints. I just told you most food demand growth will be in Africa. Roughly 70–75% of food is consumed in the same country in which the underlying commodities were produced. So you have to be prepared to produce more food in Africa. Well, the plot on the top shows you that most African countries, ignore the lines because this was produced for a different purpose. The reason I include this is if you notice the scales here, 0 is pretty close to the top of the vertical scale. And these scales are showing us nutrient fluxes in two of the essential nutrients in soils for plant growth, N and P. And the mass of the dots from sub-Saharan Africa are all beneath the 0 line. So soils are being consistently depleted of nutrients in sub-Saharan Africa, where most demand growth is going to occur, and therefore most supply growth has to occur. It's hard to boost supply vigorously when soil quality is deteriorating. Second problem is water. Global water withdrawal, shown in the lower graphic, have increased to the point that more than 70% of global fresh water already goes to agriculture. Asia's pretty much maxed out the capacity to use fresh water in agriculture. So the ability to expand water use for agriculture is roughly 0 across the continent. There are pockets where that's not true. Africa's got a little bit more room, but not tremendous room. So these slow our ability to grow supply at the rates we did previously. And add to that the fact that many of the low-hanging fruit in ag research and development have already been harvested. So we see strong indications of slowing productivity growth. So these mean that we face some real challenges because the demand is going to keep growing, but supply growth has been slowing. And that's the fundamental reason why we have seen food prices creep up steadily, as I'll show you in just a few slides. These challenges are formidable, but I submit that they're also manageable. This is not the first time we face this situation. In human history, this has been faced repeatedly. Most recently, this was the same challenge faced roughly 100 years ago. You know, in the United States, we saw this dramatic increase in crop yields in the United States, as depicted on the left. It started roughly around World War II. Part of this was World War II economic stimulus, but much of it was technological improvements. It was soil and water conservation after the Great Dust Bowl. It was the rise of hybrid maize and the use of nitrogen fertilizer developed with the Haber-Bosch process. And you see that this was essentially a flat line of no crop yield growth in maize and corn in the United States until the mid part of the 20th century. And then it's been effectively a straight line with a bunch of oscillation around it due to weather, increasing at a reasonably steady rate thereafter. We've seen this in the rest of the world through the Green Revolution. You have a picture here of famous development of rice, of IR8, the original high-yielding rice variety. We saw rice growth, rice productivity growth dramatically outpace population growth in Asia and Africa, such that you wound up seeing a significant decline in rice prices when many more pessimistic prognosticators were forecasting rapid price rises. So these are technological advances that emerged in the face of prior challenges 100 years ago, 50 years ago, and more recently, we've seen really important innovations that arise in response to today's challenges. So the central challenge of improving food security is reducing poverty. The central graphic is an image from the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, which is the world's largest safety net program. India enacted a constitutional right to 100 days paid employment by the federal government. It enacted this as a constitutional right a bit more than a decade ago. And since then, it has had a dramatic effect in absorbing surplus labor in rural India where people otherwise went hungry. India is home to more undernourished people than any other country on earth. The nutritional status measured in a variety of ways has been improving dramatically, thanks not least of which not to any food intervention directly, but rather to just ensuring people could earn a minimum wage for basic employment for a period if they needed it. The next graphic is a young girl eating a ready-to-use therapeutic food, often goes by the trade name Plumpy Nut. This one produced in Rhode Island by a company called Elsevier. Most children who die in food emergencies are not dying because they aren't getting adequate caloric intake. It's all of the mineral and vitamin deficiencies that leave them especially vulnerable to any of a variety of diseases, and they succumb to those. This ready-to-use therapeutic food is basically peanut butter enriched with a lot of vitamins and minerals, put in a simple shelf-stable sachet so you don't need a cold chain, and it has been instrumental in reducing child morbidity and sharply reducing child mortality in food emergencies around the world. Not all innovations have to happen on the farm. Many of them are happening post-farm gate in processing. And finally, biofortified maize. So the orange maize you see here has had a genetic transformation, not using transgenics, by the way, to be able to concentrate more provitamin A to address vitamin A deficiencies, the leading cause of blindness, night blindness in kids around the world. So these sorts of innovations are arising because of pressures. In economics, we term this induced innovation. There's some incentive, some challenge that induces people to come up with solutions to the problems we face. History tells us that we can and typically do come up with those solutions, but they're not automatic. And in particular, what we have to do is follow what appropriately for a Wisconsin audience is a progressive strategy in two senses of the term progressive. The first is to believe we can make progress, to trust in science, that science can help unlock opportunities we did not previously have. And second, to demonstrate solidarity with the poor. And one of the central points I will try to make in future slides, made in a book I recently released that began life as an expert panel for Nature on innovations in agri-food systems, we have to bundle them. These can't be divorced. You can't just rely on good science. Developing a brilliant new product like Plumpy Nut that can save children's lives doesn't get it out if you don't solve the intellectual property problems and the supply chain problems and the procurement problems that plagued US food aid for some time before we could scale that up in delivery and food emergencies. You need the innovations of institutions and policies that show solidarity with the poor to go with the new science, the new engineering that gives us opportunities we didn't have before. And finally, we have to define the problems correctly. The problems are no longer crop yields. That was the challenge we faced back in the 1930s. That was a challenge we thought we faced in the 1960s and 70s. Today, crop yields are plenty adequate to take care of everybody's nutritional needs. We spend only about half of grain produced in the world on food. The rest is going to livestock feed and biofuels. The real problems now are not insufficient energy, it's micronutrient deficiencies. We have something on the order of 3 billion people who don't get the right minerals and vitamins in their diets on a daily basis. And it's obesity and overweight, that they're getting too much calorie intake relative to energy expenditure as we've all become more sedentarized, he says, sitting down. And it's not hunger, it's these other complexes of malnutrition besides simply insufficient energy intake. So if these are manageable problems, what is it we need to be tackling? What are the big challenges? And I like to term these the 4 horsemen, and sometimes to use the simple acronym C2M2, because 2 of them start with C and 2 of them start with M. So the first of these is climate change. It is very hard to overstate how important combating climate change in a timely and aggressive way is to resolving the food security challenges and national security challenges. So the climate change problem has 2 different dimensions to it. The more overlooked one is the demand side impact. So climate change is accelerating people's displacement from their homes, their involuntary displacement. So we see this in people in low-lying coastal areas who wind up becoming climate refugees. We're already seeing this from small island states where sea level rise and more intense cyclones are causing more people to flee to other places. I do a lot of work in East Africa where a devastating drought has been hitting the pastoral areas yet again. These sorts of crises fuel demand because people are displaced, and it is much less efficient to feed people once they have had to leave their homes than when they stay where they were, where they had adapted mechanisms for producing and procuring food effectively. So climate change has an adverse effect on demand. The big effect comes through the supply side, that as many farmers in Wisconsin feel, I'm sure, because we hear this from farmers in upstate New York all the time, you know, that the headwinds caused by changing weather are getting worse. Brilliant work done by my Cornell colleague Ariel Ortiz-Bobea and several collaborators has put fairly precise, careful numbers to this by simulating what the world would be like if we didn't have anthropogenic climate change. That's what ACC is here. And when they run a bunch of simulations based off of the integrated assessment models for what the world would have been like without anthropogenic climate change and what it has been in the actual world we observe, you see on the left what's the loss of productivity. TFP is total factor productivity. So it's a way of capturing the total loss once we account for changes in all inputs, land, labor, fertilizer, et cetera. And the takeaway here is that starting in the 80s, we started seeing a real decrease, a real loss of productivity in global agriculture due to climate change. And it's now averaging out at a little more than 20%, and it's much worse than that in the tropical areas. In sub-Saharan Africa, the adverse effect on TFP is closer to 40%. You can see this in the right-hand graphic in a slightly different way. The blue cone is showing you what we would have seen in terms of average total factor productivity if the world had not been suffering climate change, but what we've actually observed is in red. And the takeaway here is that in 2020, when they were finishing this analysis, the total factor productivity loss due to climate change cost us somewhere between 14 and 7 years of growth. So we would have, it's like being set back, as if we had this tremendous run up and then we had the productivity set back by 7 to 13 years worth of productivity. So climate change is one of the big challenges that we face. The national security complex in the United States is really concerned about climate change's impact on global food security. The second C is conflict. Conflict is the primary driver of hunger in the world today. This comes through two different mechanisms. The first is displacement. I already mentioned climate displacement, but most forced displacement is conflict. At the end of 2021, we had about 89 million people, according to the UN, about 89 million people forcibly displaced. And that was before Russia invaded Ukraine, which has displaced about 15 million, roughly half of them internally displaced, still within Ukraine, roughly half have left for neighboring countries. Since the UN began counting, we haven't seen this many forcibly displaced people in the world. This is truly a massive humanitarian tragedy with very serious food security consequences. People who leave their homes have left their jobs. They've left their routine safety nets, their informal safety nets in their community. They've lost their livelihoods. They're dependent upon humanitarian assistance. Lots of people fall into fairly serious food insecurity when they become forcibly displaced. And today, more than 3/4 of stunted children, the children suffering the most serious permanent consequences of malnutrition, are in conflict-affected nations. The old image of people growing up in peaceful but very poor rural villages and children suffering short stature because they would go hungry, that's increasingly a relic of history. There's just not that much of it anymore. Most of the kids who suffer serious long-term malnutrition manifest in stunting, meaning low stature for their age. They're suffering this because of the disruptions of conflict. And the population in these fragile settings has been growing. It's more than 2 billion, so more than 1/4 of the world's population, but it's more than 80% of the world's poor. Conflict and poverty go hand in hand. It's not just that conflict causes poverty and food insecurity, it's also that it flows the other way around. I mentioned before that I'd done some work with the national intelligence community. In 2011, senior folks at the National Intelligence Agency's Joint Task Force called me up and said, we no longer have analysts who understand food security issues in the intelligence system in the US. And we see the Arab Spring, we see governments falling and bread riots, and we need to understand better. We need to get our analysts up to speed quickly on what should we be looking for? What are the issues? So would you convene a group of experts who would assess what's the relationship between food security and socio-political stability in different countries around the world? And so we quickly grabbed some of the world's best experts, convened a gathering at Cornell where they presented their findings to a group of analysts from various intelligence agencies, none of whom were allowed to register their names. It was an entirely unclassified operation, by the way. The result of that was edited into this Oxford University press book, Food Security and Socio-Political Stability, which makes a strong case, I believe, that food insecurity indeed causes unrest. It's not just that food insecurity is caused by unrest, but there's really bidirectional feedback here. We saw this in unrest in more than 50 nations in the 2007 to 2012 period, the last time we saw a very sharp run up in food prices globally. We saw it, we've seen it in Sri Lanka already this year, where government fell in part because of food price problems. And it links to the first challenge, climate change. Climate change is making this worse. By any of a lot of different indicators, warmer temperatures lead to more interpersonal violence, both at the level of nation states and at individual violence. Crime goes up. And we see this especially in conjunction with things like droughts. So these are the first two horsemen we have to combat. If we want to improve food security, we've got to tackle climate change and we've got to tackle conflict. We also have to improve macroeconomic management. Again, food poverty is the main cause of food insecurity. And macroeconomic growth reduces poverty. It doesn't reduce poverty equally in all places. It depends how that growth manifests. It is very rare that the poor benefit as economies shrink. The powerful and rich will always get their share. Only do growing economies generate surpluses that get shared with the poor. So macroeconomic growth is, unfortunately, a necessary condition for substantial and sustained poverty reduction. Today, we have more than 3 billion people who can't afford a healthy diet. And I emphasize healthy diet. So the earlier numbers of less than 800 million people were those who don't get enough dietary energy, enough calories. This is about having enough minerals and vitamins as well. So COVID has been a massive setback. COVID especially hit hard places that don't have strong safety nets. In the United States, strikingly, in December 2020, in the December 2020 Consumer Current Population Survey, the Census and USDA's Economic Research Service jointly collected data used to assess how many Americans are suffering food insecurity. And in December 2020, when we were still down almost 14 million jobs relative to February of 2020, there was no change in the prevalence of food insecurity in the United States relative to December 2019, before the pandemic. Why was that? Because of a lot of safety nets that kicked in. Everything from rent moratoria to substantial increases in SNAP expenditures to the stimulus payments, the checks that went to households that had an income below a certain threshold. All of those things together meant that we didn't see a sharp increase in the number of Americans who were suffering food insecurity in spite of a massive macroeconomic shock. That didn't happen in most of the rest of the world. Most of the rest of the world, we've seen a pretty sharp increase in food insecurity because countries just didn't have the same safety net capacity. Another problem that's hit much of the developing world is with the macroeconomic shock of COVID and the associated slowdown and instability, those routinely induce investors' flight to the dollar. So you see people putting their investments into US dollar denominated instruments, especially into safer instruments like treasury, bills and bonds. The problem is in the developing world, when you're facing debts that have to be repaid in dollars and you're paying for commodity imports, food commodity imports, often denominated in dollars, that flight to the dollar induces dollar appreciation and fuels inflation in those places. So these macroeconomic issues are incredibly important for addressing food security because we need to see poverty reduction, which comes from employment and real wage growth, and we need to avoid sharp increases in prices that come from inflation and from appreciation of the dollar. And that leads to the fourth and final M, the fourth horseman, which is market prices and volatility. The lower left graphic shows you how food prices, adjusted for inflation, how food prices have evolved since 1990. The all-time low inflation-adjusted food price was December 1999. This millennium, we've seen oscillating increases in real food prices, as depicted by the blue line. The red line shows you the smooth price volatility, a measure of lagged standard deviation of prices. There are really two things that I want you to take away from this graphic. The first is that we were seeing sort of oscillating prices, but if we took this back further, it was a downward trend until the turn of the millennium. And then we had slow growth and a big spike that began in 2007, interrupted briefly by the Great Recession, jumped back up in 2011-12. And during those times, we had that serious macroeconomic and serious political instability around the world. Real food prices settled for a little while, and then they began running up sharply relatively early in the pandemic. Starting in May of 2020, global food commodity prices began to increase. So net, as you see in the little table embedded within that graphic, you know, we've seen prices so far this decade up like something on the order of 17% relative to last decade on average, and the price volatility has doubled. So there are a number of pieces behind that, a number of drivers behind that. part of it has to do with globalization. And some of your friends who are involved in agriculture in Wisconsin will likely tell you, as my neighbors, I live in a small farming town north of Ithaca. Many of my neighbors tell me that as markets have increasingly integrated, they don't get the natural price stabilization effect of local markets. They're just fully integrated into the global market. So when yields are down, prices don't rise to compensate for that the way they once did. So part of the problem also is that we have effective World Trade Organization disciplines against import restrictions. The various trade agreements around agriculture, most of them negotiated in the 1990s, 80s, and 90s, they were in that period when prices were falling. They were negotiated to prevent countries from erecting import barriers to protect against low-cost imports coming in. But prices turned at the turn of the millennium. And as prices have been increasing, the pressures on trade policies have flipped. Now, the real trade policy measures of consequence are export bans. China just earlier this week enacted an export ban on different maize meals. India enacted one on wheat earlier this year. We've seen these sorts of export bans, which are a different type of protectionist measures. It's trying to protect domestic consumers against food price increases rather than domestic producers against food price decreases. We have no disciplines for that. We have no way of ensuring orderly trade regimes. And that creates some serious problems, serious price volatility, because when governments begin banning exports, importers panic. They have to suddenly search for new suppliers. And so much of the price spikes that we've seen, like that we saw from late February through May this year after Russia invaded Ukraine, those were price spikes that are largely induced by customers frantically seeking out new suppliers and overbidding for those. The markets settle down reasonably quickly, but you get these tremendous spikes during that time, and hungry people don't have the money on hand to be able to suddenly absorb a big price spike. But another problem is we've seen growing concentration within agri-food value chains, from upstream seed suppliers and agrochemical suppliers through the middle of the chain, where we've seen significant concentration in things like meat packing, through even the grocery retail industries have gotten increasingly concentrated, especially in the developing world where those are growing quickly. So the problem is that this all fuels inflation. The Economists just a few days ago had the two graphics on the lower right that I reproduced here because I thought these capture really well. The center graphic shows you that food inflation worldwide has outpaced general inflation in virtually all of the world. Only in Oceania, only in New Zealand and Australia have food prices not increased faster than general prices. And in Asia and Africa, they've been increasing much faster than in Europe or the Americas or Oceania. And food price inflation has been especially pronounced, as you see in the map in the lower right, in places like Venezuela and Zimbabwe and Sudan, where you have already a whole complex of different problems. You just don't have the ability to absorb dramatic food price increases without serious humanitarian consequences and therefore serious civil unrest consequences. Sri Lanka went through a really rapid period of food price increases that, on top of all the other grievances its population had with its government, caused them to take to the street. I'll show you a rather graphic image later on. So what do we need to do? We have to tackle those problems by first updating our objectives. The objectives 50 years ago were grow basic crop yields. The chair of the CGIAR, the International Ag Research System, famously said that his job was to grow the world's pile of rice. Our challenge is different today. We've got to tackle multiple things at once. We summarize this in this new book out. This is open access, by the way. You can download this for free if you like and read it. So this began life as an expert panel for Nature on the challenges of innovation in agri-food systems. And the central points we make there are that we have to embrace that there are multiple objectives. So we summarize this in the mnemonic HERS for a healthy, equitable, resilient, and sustainable agri-food system. And we emphasize the importance of bundling social innovations and technical innovations per the two parts to progressivity that I mentioned earlier. There's plenty of really impressive science, technology, and innovation in the pipeline. The point of this graphic isn't for you to read anything. We just went through and we did an inventory of kind of new technologies, innovations that have the potential to really impact at scale. And these span value chains, segments from primary production through food environments and the wholesale retail environment and recapturing of food waste. They come from all sorts of different areas: digital technologies, genetic technologies, mechanical technologies, policy innovations. And they're at various stages of readiness. Some are already being deployed. Many of you have seen robots and drones in operation in Wisconsin agriculture, but there's amazing stuff that is still in people's computers, not quite out, or it's in experimental labs. You know, re-engineering the genome of rice so that it will photosynthetic capacity changes so that it can cope with climate change much better than the current C3 version of rice can. New technologies for any of a whole range of things. Some of my colleagues here at Cornell are pretty far along in developing corn that will basically push all its nitrogen back into its root system, into the soil just before harvest. These are kind of amazing discoveries, not yet in use. But the point is, we have abundant pipelines of new innovations emerging precisely because prices have been rising and people are increasingly aware of the crises. But we have to make the R&D go better. We need it more productively directed. One of the, I think, easiest ways to see this is there's been massive run-up in private investment in agri-food technologies in the last several years. But of the more than $50 billion that went into venture capital funding in the agri-food tech space last year, more than a third of it was for e-grocery apps. This is not appreciably changing any meaningful productivity statistic, nutritional outcome statistic. It's purely a matter of kind of beating out others for market share. We need to adjust incentives to make solving societal problems financially attractive. There are clever innovations in using advanced market commitments that have been used effectively for combating tuberculosis and pneumonia in the developing world. I've championed an idea of benevolent patent extensions. Basically, if you come up with something that solves a world problem, but there's not a commercial market, you can instead extend the patent protection on a luxury good so that you can reap your profits from a different market rather than the non-commercial market you're solving. There are a range of ideas out there, but the point is they're all targeted at solving societal problems financially attractive. The S&P 500 companies in the US were sitting on $1.7 trillion in cash, on essentially zero return assets at the start of this calendar year. There's plenty of private finance available to invest. People just aren't pulling it off the sidelines and putting it into these things because the returns aren't high enough yet. We can take care of that, but you need to make some adjustments in policies and regulations. Intellectual property is an issue, et cetera. There's a really nice paper. Those who are interested in this issue of sort of how do we encourage more R&D to get to scale to really change agri-food systems. My Cornell colleague, Mario Ferrero, led a really nice paper on this in Nature Food in 2020. And the key point of that is that all this technology, that abundant pipeline of new science and technologies, just is not going to deliver without the right socio-cultural, socio-political drivers behind it to help to translate new discoveries into impacts at scale. A couple of the key ones are we need much more proactive, what I term de-agrarianization. De-agrarianization meaning increasingly moving food production off of the land and into factories, basically. So that food demand growth we're going to see cannot be met simply by terrestrial-based agrarian production. We're going to increasingly have to produce using recaptured waste, like you see on the left. This is taking food waste and turning it into pastes that are effective ingredients in food manufacturing. Vertical farming, this is a photo of one of my former students' vertical farming operation in urban India, growing high quality greens and turning a profit. And some of you may recognize on the right is Impossible Foods production line, taking plant-based ingredients and turning them into ground beef substitutes and a variety of other things. There are lots of these sorts of technologies. The price points for these, the unit costs of production, are falling very fast. They're going to be increasingly viable commercially. And when they hit points where they become where they have price advantages over traditional products, we're going to see a rapid shift occurring in where, especially food processors and manufacturers, source ingredients from. They're no longer going to get casein coming from dairy farms, just like they don't get rennet coming from veal farms anymore. So these shifts leave rural places like the town I live in or the areas around Madison very vulnerable if we're not proactive about managing this decoupling of food production from the land. And that has tremendous potential for social unrest in a range of places. So we need to manage de-agrarianization quite proactively, creating new rural livelihood opportunities. The things that endow farmers with the ability to grow crops, that they can capture solar energy well, that they have lots of land, that's lots of space for renewable energy capture. These are also areas where you can create lots of the manufacturing that you need because you have available space and you can retrain meatpacking labor to make cultured meat products as well. But we have to get proactive about that. And this is one of the concerns I have for unrest and political changes in middle-income countries and even high-income countries as we see these transitions happening. We need to recapture waste. The principle is called circularity that people focus on increasingly. We've got to have cheap food for the poor if we're going to combat food insecurity. But cheap food inevitably means lots of waste and loss because people just don't work hard at conserving things that don't cost much. You don't see a whole lot of discussion of waste of diamonds or waste of Lexus cars because they're expensive. People are very careful to conserve and protect them. But people throw away bananas all the time. They throw away partially eaten loaves of bread or yogurt that's past the due date, even though it hasn't yet turned color. All of these things are a consequence of cheap food. If we need cheap food and we need to reduce food loss and waste, we need to start recovering the nutrients in that system much better. There are a range of things you can do. There are some really clever startup businesses that are capturing human waste. Sanergy is a company that does this in Kenya and a few other places. One of my colleagues has worked on using the bones from slaughterhouses are rich sources of phosphorus, which is a very scarce non-renewable resource in the earth that's concentrated very heavily in just a few countries. We don't want to be terribly vulnerable to political disruption in Morocco or China deciding it's not willing to export phosphates anymore. The hurricane that recently hit Florida came within about 50 miles of knocking out most of the United States phosphate production. A slightly different trajectory to that hurricane, farmers have problems in the US. But we can recover these if we start developing the technologies that'll reprocess what right now are waste products. Food waste is easily turned into feed for worms that are very high quality feed for livestock, which would save us roughly 35% of cultivated land that goes into feed production. There are a range of things we can do that can effectively use the scarce resources we have to meet that growing food demand and resist some of the challenges we're going to face if food prices continue to rise. Finally, we got to focus beyond just the farm gate. Most of the value addition in the food system is actually after the farm. In the United States, only about 16 cents out of every dollar consumers spend on food goes back to farms. The vast majority of it is in the post-harvest processing, manufacturing, retailing, wholesaling, food service sectors. And this is true worldwide. I show you here on the left figures we're publishing later this year that show from 1929 to present in the United States, the share of consumer food dollars that is actually going back to farms in blue and red. The series shifted computation at one point. And we show these numbers, the farm share of total food expenditures in different countries over time on the right. This is fairly basic economics. People pay for added attributes, higher quality, better aesthetics, someone else to make and prepare and serve me food. We pay for that. We aren't paying for a lot of extra calories and protein. So we need to focus our attention increasingly on businesses that really drive the agri-food system. And we need to bundle, as I've mentioned before. I'm going to skip this part. So let me just close by saying, why should we care for a group that's interested in foreign relations? The first reason I would argue is this is a human right. Food security is intrinsic to human flourishing. It's enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The basic definition of food security agreed by the nation states of the UN says this very clearly. And finally, our security depends upon this. This is not an old picture. This is from just a couple months ago in Colombo, Sri Lanka. The government fell in part because of people's concerns they couldn't feed their families effectively. Just as we saw in 2008 and 2011, governments increasingly struggling to maintain order in their streets and governments falling. We will see the same thing if we don't get a quick grip on the food crisis that does face us today. It's formidable, but it's manageable. Put differently, we shouldn't despair, but we also can't dally. We have a window of time in which we can address these challenges. We've prevailed as a species before when faced with food crises, but it requires a progressive strategy, both in the sense of trusting science and committing to supporting the poor, requires us to embrace multiple objectives and build the coalitions necessary to bundle both the science and the institutional and policy changes. And we have to incentivize lots of innovation. So I thank you for your time and your interest. I'm very happy to field your questions and hear your comments. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Barrett. I would just like to say personally, I have just been fascinated by your presentation and also about the positive possibilities, particularly in the area of innovation. I just find quite marvelous some of the things you were describing, and it's very hopeful. Your old friend Dan Bromley is watching this evening, and as usual, he's full of questions. So he talks about the Russian invasion of Ukraine has harmed a major source of fertilizer production. What is the outcome for some relief of that particular thing?
Oh, that's a great question. So Russia is a huge source of nitrogen fertilizer in particular. Nitrogen fertilizer production, for those who aren't aware, goes hand in hand with production of natural gas. And Russia has withheld a fair amount of its nitrogen fertilizer supply from the world market, which has driven up prices for farmers. I'm sure farmers in your community have complained about fertilizer prices. They certainly do in mine. And in many parts of the world, they're struggling even to get supplies that they would like, even if they're willing to pay a big marked up price. Brazilian farmers in particular were complaining tremendously during planting season earlier this year about just simple non-availability of fertilizer. That's knocking down yields. USDA just earlier this week updated its yield forecast for this year for basic staple grains, and they knocked it down again 0.4%, I think it was. I can't recall the exact number, but a non-trivial revision downwards to their estimates, in part because they had underestimated the degree to which farmers have reduced their fertilizer application rates. So as they had begun to collect more survey data from more countries, they've been able to establish farmers actually use much less fertilizer than planned because prices shot up. So that's going to slow supply growth. And if we don't come up with enough adequate supplies of fertilizers, that's just going to aggravate this supply-demand imbalance that's been fueling price rises. Again, there's plenty of sources of nutrients. Most of them are in our waste streams, in our food and animal and human waste streams. We have the technologies to capture and repurpose this. We just haven't yet really done this quite seriously.
Recently the UN has been sounding the alarm about the humanitarian crisis and food, especially for people in the refugee camps. And what is the basis of that? Are countries just not contributing enough money to provide, or what is causing that crisis?
So the G7 in their meeting in late June made a lot of noise about a big new commitment of new resources. And then some of you may have noticed that President Biden, speaking to the United Nations last month, pledged additional resources on top of what they had pledged at the end of June. People are stepping up and spending more, donating more. The problem is that needs are growing faster than donations. Again, we're up over 100 million forcibly displaced people in the world. We've never seen those numbers before. So if we are increasing by 15 million just from the Ukraine invasion, if we increase by 15 million the number of people who need help in regular food support because they've been cast away from their homes, you need substantial increases in donations. The UN agencies that monitor and manage the humanitarian appeals routinely report on the fill rates, as they're called, the proportion of the needs assessment that has been committed in donations. And they're pretty routinely around 30 or 35% of total needs are donated. So, and that's remained stable. The needs have expanded dramatically, donations have expanded, but they've only expanded at roughly the same rate. So we're still seeing ourselves as a world roughly 2/3 beneath where we need to be to fully satisfy the humanitarian needs of those who've been driven away from their homes. That's why there's a crisis.
Yeah, in regard to the setting of policy, you commented about how in this country we had managed through COVID pretty well by increasing the food stamps and that sort of thing. Was this a well thought out policy, or was it just trying to figure out what to do at the last minute, or how did that come about?
Well, I wasn't part of it, so I can't attest to how carefully thought out it was. Clearly, a huge amount of this was reactive. Was it wise reaction or not, I think is probably the best way to frame the question. On balance, yes, I think it was. Without question, there's a fair amount of waste. We're discovering that there was a considerable amount of fraud involved in various COVID relief measures enacted by the federal government. Certain amount of that is probably inevitable when you're trying to stand up massive programs quite quickly. This obviously had a pretty significant fiscal stimulus impact in the macroeconomy that has had implications for inflation. But what were our alternatives? We already saw terrible images of the long lines at food pantries. I do a lot of work with the food pantry, food bank system in upstate New York. And they actually measure fairly carefully their clientele. Their clientele ratcheted upwards by about 60% from February to May of 2020. And at the same time, their volunteer base collapsed because most volunteers are retirees who were unusually high risk for exposure to COVID. So many of the people they rely on to help meet clients and distribute and pack food weren't available to do it. So this was a massive problem. If we had relied purely on the private food assistance system, which was overwhelmed because it's losing volunteers as more people step up and ask for boxes of food, we would have faced some pretty serious domestic problems. I don't think we had many options. I think on balance, it was done reasonably well. It's not clear to me which policy lever most mattered here. My own conjecture, it's nothing more than that, is that the rent moratorium was the single most important thing. Because poor people have to pay their rent under most circumstances, and they forego groceries. When they didn't have to pay their rent, and a large number of low-income Americans are in arrears on their rent right now, then they could go ahead and buy groceries. So my guess is that the rent moratorium actually had a bigger impact than the increase in SNAP benefits. We're starting to see some of that play out as the rent moratorium ended in most of the US, not in all of it. And as SNAP benefits have been adjusted upwards, we've seen an increase again in food insecurity in the U.S.
I'm also very interested in the innovations you were talking about in the development of food, by technological means. And I'm just curious, is this going hand in hand with medical kinds of research? Because how do these kinds of foods work in the human body? Because now we even see some people are allergic to food additives and all of these things. So I'm just curious, how are we going to know that this wonderful new stuff won't kill us all?
It's a very important question, and the simple answer is substantial equivalence. The terminology used is whether food produced using one method is functionally the same, chemically the same as produced using the methods that we're quite accustomed to. So let me use the example of cultured meat. Some of you have probably heard this term, others may be unfamiliar with it. There are technologies out there where we can literally grow meat as you know it, as I know it from the grocery store, without having to raise livestock now. You can harvest stem cells and you can grow in a cultured medium. The cells will grow. They'll produce the tissue that you look for. It's a fairly complicated tissue engineering problem, but the basic science is now in place. There's some very recent breakthroughs on the nutrient cultures that you use to facilitate growth of this tissue. And you are literally growing the same meat that we are typically harvesting from an animal. Just you're not using a living animal as the intermediation mechanism for the cultured meat. So that's an example of a new technology, a new process for producing something that is substantially equivalent to what we're used to, but a completely different production process. There is no cow that ever appears other than the harvest of the initial stem cell line. There are other versions of this. We grow the same berries and the same greens using controlled environment agriculture, vertical farming. Just rather than them being out in sunlight or in a greenhouse, they're in a building that's using artificial light, commonly powered by wind or sun, and drip irrigation and a culture medium of fertilizer to produce. The main problem with that is energy. Everything else, the costs are actually relatively low and the price points are increasingly competitive. It's literally the exact same seed. It's just a completely different production process. Are there concerns about some new foods? Absolutely, and there should be. This is why we need food safety regulation routinely in place. It's not entirely clear that the US is exceptionally good at that already with traditional foods. So I'm not sure that we have reason to be even more concerned about that apparatus applied to new foods. More, we need to improve food safety monitoring across the board, including for traditional foods. Most people who die from foodborne disease in the United States are like 90+%. I don't know the exact number. It's essentially unheard of for people to be dying because they're poisoned by some new food. They're poisoned by stuff that's, the regular contaminants we all hear about and worry about when we go to a farmer's market.
I was interested in the picture of the child eating the peanut butter kind of food. I have tasted that before. My Rotary Club and other Rotary clubs have invested in that particular food supply for children. Does that also have, you were concerned about the minerals and all that a lot of children aren't getting, and it's stunting their development. And I think one of the big issues is in the brain development, children in refugee camps and so forth and so on. So do these substances, the peanut butter kinds of things, do they provide all of the nutrients children need?
Probably not all, but they're extremely nutrient dense. They're customized to particular types of cases of severe malnutrition. So some of them are meant to be restorative. You take kids who are suffering severe acute malnutrition, who may already manifest some nutrient deficiency based disease, and they're intended to help them to recover from that. Others are just prophylaxis. They're intended to prevent kids getting to that desperate point. But the plumpy nut is a really good case in point. I mentioned the problems of logistics and so forth. One of the problems was intellectual property. It's a patented product. The French company Nutricet that first developed it wasn't willing to let US companies manufacture this. But by US law, our PL 480, our Food for Peace program that provides the vast majority, or used to provide the vast majority of our emergency food assistance, had to buy from and ship from the United States. So you had this standoff where French intellectual property law was protecting this plumpy nut product invented by a French food manufacturer, and US law prevented us from buying from a French producer to ship abroad. And it took quite a few years for us to navigate out around that, basically by changing US budgetary appropriation so that now the US buys that using something that's not encumbered by Food for Peace's restrictions under the Farm Bill. But we still face the same core problems of intellectual property often impedes our ability to quickly scale out some of these new discoveries, especially when it's reaching into places where the original inventor is worried that their intellectual property won't be respected and protected. So this poses a real problem in South Asia in particular. Many of the companies developing some of the new therapeutic foods simply aren't willing to distribute into Bangladesh and India. I see a question about New Zealand and why New Zealand and Australia haven't seen the same rate of food price increase relative to general inflation as the rest of the world. I don't know the answer to that directly. I would hypothesize that it's because both are major agricultural exporters. We've had so much disruption of shipping that you're seeing it increasingly attractive to just retain production domestically. And so in the domestic market, you're seeing a greater share that's been retained for meeting domestic demand because they're otherwise shipping add on a cost to get it elsewhere. Shipping costs have gone up, ocean freight rates have gone up roughly threefold since pre-pandemic. So for places like Australia and New Zealand that are a long way from everything, putting your agricultural exports onto a ship and sending it abroad is increasingly expensive, and it's increasingly attractive relatively just to try to sell locally. So that's my hypothesis of why we see that part of the world hasn't experienced the same food price inflation rates that we have in most of the rest of the world. Did I miss other questions? Oh, I see Dan's got another. So much discussion is annual yields, but people live in the short run. How quickly can food suppliers pivot for seasonal problems? This is another reason for de-agrarianization. When we rely upon the natural seasonal cycles for everything, you can't pivot super fast. You only get one spring in our latitudes, right? We don't get 2 springs a year. So you can plant winter crop in some places, but not around here. But when we start to use more controlled environment agriculture, when we start to rely more on alternative proteins like cultured meats, they're actually very short cycle production lines. You can largely obviate the seasonality constraints imposed by the rotation of the earth around the sun. We can start to get beyond that when we start to de-agrarianize more of our food production. To be clear, I'm not saying we end farming. That's not going to happen, nor should it happen. But we are not in a position where we are shrinking food production and food demand. Food demand is poised to grow, and we're starting to butt up against planetary boundaries. Meeting the growth in demand is going to require coming up with new sources of supply. You're simply not going to start getting a third crop in Wisconsin, a major agricultural state, but there are just natural limits to how far you're going to be able to go in producing on your land with your water resources and your sunlight. We can get away from a bunch of that as we start to relax the constraints imposed by the land and the sun.
Dr. Barrett, let me thank you for your time and your generosity in answering questions. And as you can probably tell, this group could probably keep you all night, but I think you probably have other things to do. But anyway, thank you very much. It's been very, very enlightening and very interesting. And we hope to see you again, maybe too soon. Okay, bye-bye. Good night.
Thanks very much, everyone. Take good care. Bye-bye.